The
Hey.
mainstream novel is a congeries of endless repetition of what has already been said and seen and said, ever increasing miniaturization, autobiography, autobiography disguised as fiction, masterpieces that are dead and forgotten in 5 years or one, catatonia and black comedy that is much the mirror of stasis as it is attempted exception. Its audience is deserting it because the mimetic novel can offer nothing sustaining. Far from being a glory, modern literature is narrow, uh, world weary, sick, and unhappy. The desperate for alternatives. It is a cause for concern, and our critics and commentators have not failed us. They have been uh, they have been endlessly concerned for years without suggesting a viable alternative. Hello, BookTube, and we're here. I'm here with Scott Danielson to talk about first few essays in Alexei and Cory Panshin's SF in Dimension. And what I read badly is a little section from an essay that appeared in Extrapolation in May 1972 called "The World Beyond the Hill," which he later expanded the idea to a certain extent and wrote this huge, massive tome. When did he do this? Again, 70, no, 80, I think. Let's look at the date.
Yeah, it's got to be close to the 80s.
89, I think.
Okay. Almost the 90s.
Oh, wait a
Yeah.
minute. Let me look for a better date here. Yeah, 1989. So that's the
Very
thing. I
good.
think they said it
Hmm.
took 20 years to do this.
Yeah.
They started it in 1969.
So that's interesting. So this SF in Dimension, I don't have a hard copy, but can you tell me when it was published? I
Yeah,
mean,
this,
each essay it says the one you read from is from
yeah.
May 1972.
The hardcover first edition was 1976 by Advent Publishing out of Chicago. And
Mm-hmm.
so was the se- second edition
Yeah.
um,
Right.
revised or added to. There's about five more essays that's not in here.
Very cool. So
And
yeah, very interesting stuff. So Alexei and Corey are a husband and wife team,
yeah.
and you said that Alexei passed away recently.
Yeah, I was thinking 2023, but no, I moved. No, wait a minute. So when did I move? I
You can
moved
actually look it
in
up. Yeah. Go ahead.
either
Mm-hmm.
2022. Yeah, I think it was 2022 in August.
Yep. 2022 August is what it says.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
And but the introduction in this one was written for the second edition 1980, and it's sort of a co-written thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they just sort of, they set your expectations for the essays. They're saying that they're more or less chronological, and it's their thought process as they're going on. Like
Yeah.
they were, I guess, dissatisfied with the new wave, and like a lot of people stopped writing. Science fiction writers stopped writing because of the new wave, and there was lots of arguments about it with editors, even more than writers, but
Mm-hmm.
editors and fans.
Yeah.
And they say that there's going to be contradictory things in their essays. They're exploring,
Yeah.
it's not objective. And I really like that they're saying that, because a lot of people, a lot of critics say, though, no, this is the way it is,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no room for anything. And he says they'll go over material all the time. And this last essay, as I said, it's called "The World Beyond the Hill," and
Mm-hmm.
he basically, like, there's a lot in it, so I'm just going to skim the surface of it, really, with the fact that he talks about that in ancient times and up to around 1700, a lot of sort of fiction and stories were told not about the world that was around you that you could see. It was
Mm-hmm.
about a world beyond the hill, something that people hadn't seen, and they were interested in that.
Yeah. Can I? I'd love to read just part of this from the very beginning of that, because
Yeah,
he sets this thing up. He says you've got two different types, right? And then he basically goes into the second type being the important stuff, right?
yeah.
So he says every storyteller has the choice of setting his stories his commentaries on the universe, in one or the other of two realms of the imagination. One is a world in which the facts of direct perception dominate. This world is the mimetic image of the common everyday places his listeners all know, and he calls it the cave, the city, or the global village. And then he says the other is a world beyond fact where speculative fantasy runs free, the world beyond the hill. And then he says, at first glance, this may not seem like much of a choice, but I'm going to skip forward a little bit. But he talks about village fiction, which is the first type, has been domestic farce, crude humor, bloody anecdote. And he says it has been Aristophanes' The Clouds, with Socrates suspended in a basket, The Merry Wives of Windsor, with Falstaff stuffed in a laundry hamper. It's been the Satyricon, The Miller's Tale from Chaucer, and Robin Hood. And it says it has been distinctly the smaller and lesser part of Western literature. And then this grabbed me right here. And he says, on the other hand, the fruit of the unhistorical, ungeographical world beyond the hill has been the Odyssey, the Oresteia, Beowulf, Tristan, Parsifal, the Divine Comedy, Morte d'Arthur, Gargantua and Pantagruel, the Fairy Queen, Dr. Faustus, King Lear, The Tempest, and Paradise Lost. The world beyond the hill has been the heartland of our literature. It has owned all our best and most meaningful stories.
Yeah. But around 1700, like he says, that kind of changed, and they went to the mimetic literature, just copying every day.
Because leading up to this too, all four of the essays before, he's playing with or investigating or exploring what science fiction is.
Yeah.
Right? And then like he's talking about Hugo Gernsback and how Hugo Gernsback would read a collection of the best of, and I can't remember what year, but it was the best of, and he says, no, one of these is science fiction, the other ones are not.
Well, which one?
But which one, right? And not only that, but the table of contents, I would say, that was like mostly science fiction in my head. But I thought that was interesting. So what Hugo Gernsback envisioned as science fiction, which was like an educational, rooted in science, more than entertainment thing. It was more important than entertainment. It was education, right?
Yeah, and he goes on to throughout the thing saying that if that's just the appeal of science fiction is the science in it, then how can stories still have an appeal that the science turns out to be wrong?
Right.
Like
so if you have something written before we split the atom, how is that an interesting story, right? Because that means that they would all go obsolete. But so if we pause there for a second, I mean, there's still a joy in reading science fiction that's dated. The science is dated, right? Like the Martian stories of Edgar Rice Burroughs, which were never attempting to be scientific, right? He wasn't like, this is, he got his hero to Mars through magical means, practically, right? So you could say that it's fantasy. But it's interesting because even I, when I think about what I like, I continually talk about, hard science fiction being kind of my favorite subgenre. I like Tau Zero by Poul Anderson. I would say hard science fiction, if I define that, I would just say hard science fiction are stories in which the author attempts to make the science in it real. He's extrapolating. He or she may be extrapolating from a bedrock of knowledge, right? They're saying, okay, science is here today, and I may extrapolate from that, but I'm standing on this bedrock of what I think is truth, right? But there's a lot of science fiction that I would still call science fiction that isn't that, And I think maybe Gernsback liked that type of fiction only.
Yeah.
The hard science fiction, right? Which I would just call a small subset of what I would call science fiction still.
Yeah. And then Heinlein and, even Asimov, like with variations, and Campbell is the idea of that it's a reaction against this thing, or that how the technology changes society.
Yeah.
And and it's not just, but yeah, Hugo Gernsback, if it was just the science and none of the others, he's happy.
Right. Right. And yeah, and so it's interesting to read what I just read and realize that I agree with Panshin that the most important literature we've had has not been like hard science fiction. It's been, in fact, he goes on, and I'll let you continue before we get there, but just the list of the works that he says fall into this world beyond the hill concept, and it's not mimetic.
Yeah.
Those are the ones I like best. I read those and I'm excited by that list. The Odyssey, Beowulf. I love these things, and they somehow strum something deeper, and because you do have in science fiction, space opera.
Yeah.
And we were watching Babylon 5, Star Trek. We can come up with a lot of different space operas, but really those are almost often they're mimetic stories just set in space.
Yeah.
Right. But it's a rare one that is that's really getting into stuff that somehow is deeper in our psyche. Like Beowulf does, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. It's giving me a lot to think about because.
Oh yeah, like that's the thing. Is like his essays, especially this last one that I'm starting first with, is there's so much in there. Like you could take hours and hours to pick it apart, because like he talks about how that's the way sort of most storytelling was, like it was beyond the hill up to around 1700, the Renaissance,
right.
Because all of a sudden people were exploring, and then the rest of the world was known, and they wanted to know about those the way they were, rather than somebody's imagination. So that lasted for several hundred years, while there were still people doing other things, still doing these stories beyond the hill, but they were always pushed aside.
Yeah, there's always exceptions. Yeah, but he's talking about the main thrust, and it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah,
and then you get, we eventually get to like Frankenstein, right?
Yeah,
and then H.G. Wells, and yeah, I mean that's what I kind of consider the beginning of science fiction was Frankenstein.
Yeah, that's basically Brian Aldiss's view, but that in his Billionaire and Trillionaire Spree.
Yeah, that may be where I got it. Yeah.
Yeah, he takes a little different, and Lester Del Rey says too that there were many things before that did the same type of thing. So it's not quite the first, but it's the one that made the impact.
Yeah.
Made impact. Yeah. That's the thing. But yeah, and then like he talks about all this, and then the science fiction has never got its due as well. It's always been considered children's literature, but then he talks about things that are the stuff beyond the hills, like Cinderella and the fairy story, but they were done originally for adults, but now they're children's stories.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Have you ever been in a library where they shelve all their science fiction in the children's section?
Yeah, I think I have. Yeah,
I was one, and I'm looking at some of these. I'm like, God, you have no idea what's in this.
Yeah,
it's sitting there next to Tom Sawyer. There's some book about like a marriage contracts or some extrapolation into the future, where you can be married to several people at the same time or something like that in these contracts. I'm like, this novel is not, it's not meant for the children's section.
No, but yeah, it's because people don't, in general, they don't understand it.
Just occasionally you get a library like that, and I don't think most of them are. In fact, from my experience, most of them are not like that. But it just shows a deep misunderstanding of a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, and like I'm just trying to refresh my memory of with the other essays, because I sort of thought that that's why he put this at the end, because it's sort of a culmination of the
Yeah.
thoughts that are in the first one. But I thought
Yeah.
maybe start with the thoughts
And
and
feel
then
free, yeah, feel
go
free to
back.
keep going in that. I just wanted to make
Yeah,
sure that at the very opening of this last essay, the last of the five, he's talking about two different things, right? And
yeah,
he's putting literature in two buckets.
yeah,
Mimetic, which is a mimic of reality,
yeah,
and then the world beyond the hill, which is an extrapolation from reality. Um, and then not only that, but he clearly believes that that's where the good stuff is,
yeah.
which
Because
is
like,
interesting because he's talking about the new wave being not for it, because the first essay started talking about the arguments between fans and authors about new wave, like this incursion into our stuff by these people. You know what I mean?
yeah,
And he seemed to take the side of the establishment, or the the old stuff, right?
yeah. But he
And
but he
then
sort of
now,
realized that I
yeah,
think that science fiction up to that point was sort of like the old world beyond the hill stuff up to like 1700.
hmm
It only went so far, but it had to then change and it had to adapt what the new stuff about exploration was doing, because you can no longer talk about or people didn't want to read about the interior of Africa of being like H. Rider Haggard or Tarzan,
hmm
because we
right,
know what it's like. So but if you can continue to write that, but you're not going to get that many people interested,
yeah, yeah,
because people at that point wanted to know the reality. They wanted like either historical reality, and then they wanted the mimetic stuff that put people into those places and talk
hmm
about that. But because we become a global village, uh, the people realize that just talking about things like this doesn't satisfy people anymore.
yeah,
Like that's where the first paragraph that I read was that the mimetic fiction has just regurgitated the same thing over and over and over again, and there's nothing new with it. So where do you go? You go into the Beyond the Hill, but you change Beyond the Hill even from what it was with the old science fiction. I think that's
hmm
that. I think that's what he's saying, because he
Well,
ends.
I think it is. How about we read that last paragraph in
Yeah,
that essay?
yeah,
Do you want me to read
yeah.
that, or you want to read it?
You read it because you read better than I do at the
Okay.
moment.
Oh, no problem. Let's see. So he says, let's see. Okay. He says, now once again, we have the potential of a mature literature of psychological integration, and just in time. If we are to survive, the mental universe we inhabit must be remade. We must make new connections in our minds, new connections with each other, and new connections with the world. Now, as in times past, speculative fantasy will aid in the making. So he's clearly looking at this. It's interesting, first of all, that he's writing in the 70s. Again, this was
Yeah,
1972, and he talks a lot about the state of the world, and how difficult it is and everything like that. I mean, it's amazing to be reading this today, because
yeah,
he could write that today, right?
yeah,
And then, but then he's just talking about this literature as a method to push us forward. In another essay, he talked about that science fiction writers have this. I think he called it alternatives, options or something. Like when you
yeah,
look into the future and you write a story about the future, you're giving an alternative to what's going on today,
yeah,
right? So your reaction to hardship and difficulty in society, you can write dystopias,
yeah,
or you can write alternatives, and say this is the way forward, which to me is what Star Trek was. It's not anymore, right? But Star Trek, the original series, and I would even say TNG, there was an optimism that existed in those series where you could watch that and say, that's a future I would actually like to be in. And in some ways, humanity has strived toward that exact future. Cell phones. I mean, there's a number of little technological advances that have come from that. You read
Yeah.
stories all the time of a scientist that was inspired by Star Trek as a kid who went on to do something that actually existed in Star Trek, invented some gadget or something like that.
Well, and
So
also,
yeah, but he was practically saying, hey, it's a responsibility of authors to show us out of here. How do we get
yeah,
out of here? This is how, right?
yeah,
So it's interesting that he's holding science fiction in such a high regard as that.
yeah,
And in the 70s, Star Trek was just coming out. I mean, there was no idea that there was going to be influence or anything like that. But that's one of the things I lament about what's happened to the Star Trek in the latest iterations is the loss of that optimism. It's not optimistic fiction anymore at all. It's dystopia. So
because he also talks about that, you know, at that time and our world, we're living in the 19 what the view of 19th century utopia is,
mhm.
but it's not satisfying.
Yeah,
It's not satisfying to people. So when you write stories about the mimetic fiction of what's around, it's not satisfying people.
right.
So you have to move forward with stuff, and it's like he comes down kind of heavy in the first essay for New Wave, but he also doesn't fully embrace to say science fiction should stay the old way either. He's
Right.
saying that there
Mhm.
has to be a change. Like it's like when the 1700s, the Enlightenment or the Renaissance came along. You had to change. You had to add things. So he's sort of trying to find a middle path, a middle way.
Hmm.
I think between the two, and it's not. I think he's like that's where it says in the beginning that he's learning. He's fumbling along, throwing out ideas, and he will contradict himself, or he'll trod the same ground again with the essays, but maybe with a little different bent to
Yeah.
it.
Hmm.
And
I
that's
think
what I
that's
really like.
admirable. By the way,
Yeah,
that's admirable. It's something, I used to blog quite a bit and things. So you'd write a blog, and then I think it's a human tendency. You put that in print, and then you feel like you need to defend it for the rest of your life. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Whereas in actuality, what we're doing is we're growing and we're moving through time. And if we're presented with new information or deeper understanding, we should embrace that.
yeah,
And I love that he was just like, oh, let's print all these rather than
yeah.
I don't agree with that anymore. Let's not do that. Because you're following his line of thought through time, and I think it's great.
Yeah, and it just because the whole aspect I think is of learning and changing things as time goes on, and because you can use the world beyond the hill, it's like here you can't have a discussion in a real novel about how having robots in your house is going to change society.
Hmm.
It just doesn't, it's
Right.
not happening here, but it,
Hmm.
it it works on many levels because it works on the levels of technology of doing this, or it also has the ramifications of just people losing their jobs.
Yeah.
But it makes you think in a different
It,
avenue, like
it
it's
absolutely
a
does.
different
And,
paradigm.
and when I think about automation and things like that were factories getting automated and things like that. As a science fiction reader, somebody who's been reading science fiction forever, um, to me, what I see is an opportunity for society to change and move forward and be more pleasant for people. You know,
Yeah,
it's like, do we need to work 40-hour weeks anymore? Could the result of more automation be we're gonna work 30 hours a week now? You know what I mean? Where we don't have to put in 40 plus hours. Uh, the problem is, how do you get from here to there? In reality, you've got companies that, well, they want a cost cut, right? So it's not like they're going to pay you 40 hours of wage to do 30 hours of work, and there's going to be a hump to get over there. So again, if you hold like the Star Trek world, how do you get from here to the Star Trek world,
yeah,
like economically, right?
yeah.
I've thought
Well,
about that
that's
a lot before. It's like, how do you do that? Well, you've got a lot of greed to pass through. So
Yeah, well, that's where he's saying like you're able to with the world beyond the hill. explore these possibilities,
Yeah, and show the
explore these
way.
things, and
Yeah.
make people start thinking about this.
Mm-hmm.
People will start thinking about these things, and I think that's what he's saying. You have to think about these things because people are just they're in a stasis. Like he talks about the fiction, it's just in this way they can't think outside of the box. I don't care for that term,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess that works because if you're dealing with it in the world beyond the hill, which is not real,
Mm-hmm.
you can explore so many different avenues that way, and then there might be a way out of the problem here because people have thought. You change your thought processes, and he talks about that. You have to change your thought processes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and which I think is actually is true, but it does sound kind of silly when you say it. In
Mm-hmm.
some ways that doesn't sound real, but they always had to do that. It's like anytime there's an invention, like what happened when sailing ships disappeared and stuff like this, and people had to readjust and stuff like that. They had to think differently in order to just as something as that, or just having, I don't know, the combustion engine over something else. That just changed society. People
Yeah.
weren't really ready for it, and people aren't ready for it now. But if like in his view, I guess, is that if you were able to explore these things, that people wouldn't be so hesitant or resil or fighting against the change. You would find a path through that to make the change better for society.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
That's that's I think that's what
That's
he's
what
saying.
and he in one of his essays, I can't remember which one it was, but that's the point he was making. It was almost
Yeah,
again like a responsibility of the science fiction authors to do that exact thing. And this idea that he says we must make new connections in our minds, new connections with each other, and all that stuff. Um, it's a very I'm trying to think of what the word is. It's like he's got a very high opinion of what science fiction can do for society, you
yeah,
know. And of course, not enough people read it. So
yeah.
I don't know.
And
I don't
and,
know
and
if in a practical way
yeah,
things are happening. And in today's publishing world, I think that the story and the plots are the thing. One damn thing after another,
yeah,
just in a constant thing. That's what most people seem to be writing. They're world building, but they're not extrapolating. You know what I mean?
yeah,
They're not showing a way forward. It's more like this is cool. You know what I mean?
yeah. And well, the other thing
Alex
that's
Day is here. Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
low. And the thing is too that a lot of people, I think he knew that by saying that, by holding science fiction up, he's going to get a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's just trash." But he backs up his opinion by using this the world beyond the hill, not using science fiction specifically as that term. And he's
Mm.
saying, "Well, there's so much evidence that it worked in the past, so this is just another aspect of those stories. It's just another aspect of the world beyond the hill.
Mm.
Is science fiction is just one of those things
Yeah.
that we're talking about, and we need that world beyond the hill." That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
And science fiction is just one of the latest way of dealing with the world beyond the hill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love it. I
Yeah.
think it's great. Yep.
Yeah, because and then it gets rid of the criticism, I think, of saying that science fiction is bad. It's like, well, okay, you're saying that idea is stupid, but that that's where he built up with the other previous essays
Mm-hmm.
showing, and he does that in here. He takes a lot of time talking about the past and the world beyond the hill, and then just say, well, science fiction is just part of that as well. It's just
Mm-hmm.
the more recent aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I'm just trying to look here at the other essays. So we got, I can't remember what, Searching for the Heartland. It was fantasy and science fiction in March '72. Uh,
You talking about the first essay?
no, the fourth one.
Oh, the fourth one, Searching for the Heartland. Okay, got it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I've got some
It
stuff
starts.
highlighted in here.
Yeah, there is a question that used to be raised long, long ago when science fiction was a thoroughly dubious enterprise. that doesn't get asked much anymore, and ought to be. What is science fiction good for? What goes on in science fiction that makes it worth reading? And that's where he explores a little more. I think, yeah, this idea of that you need it, you need it because it's just one in the latest, it's the latest thing of the world beyond the hill.
Yeah. Yeah, so here's something that I highlighted from that fourth one that is again him holding this up at a really high standard. If there is any hope for us in our present moment of societal agony, it must be in the possibility of new alternatives. Science fiction, in its freedom from the limits of this moment, can offer its freedom to readers as a promise of the possibility of new alternatives, and this is SF's great virtue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I say, then he backs it up with going, talking about stuff that's ancient Greece, Aristophanes, all this, and he even throws in Shakespeare. Where what was the? Let me see. Let me find the line. I know it's at the top of the page, so I just have to flick through and find it. It might be in the last essay. I know it's at the top of the page, so if I flip through enough, I'll be able to find it. But no, it's not in the fourth one. Let's see, the fifth one or fourth one. Come on! Don't tell me this. I know it's.
Well, while you're looking, I'll read one more thing from it. It's actually the last paragraph, but again, it ties into the other one. He says, so in this essay, he set that up, and then he reviewed 5 anthologies. And then his concluding statement is, if all the stories in these 5 anthologies say anything to us, it is this: to write science fiction, a writer must necessarily be visionary enough to look for new alternatives and be brave enough to write them in discouraging times. If he is unwilling or unable, he wastes the medium, and he surely has nothing to offer the readers who have discarded mimetic fiction for its emptiness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Like, there's so much in this that you sit there and you read a paragraph and you go, wow.
Yeah. It's like, wow. Is it like, and then I think, do I agree with that or not?
Yeah.
Because
but then when you really think of it, you can see his thought processes, and that's the cool thing. And sometimes he might be a little selective, I think, at times, at pulling stuff from the past to fit his thing. And you kind of go, well, it isn't. But then he recovers himself a little bit by saying that, it's not always been like that. That's not the only way things were done. This was it. But then this is how it was. And then we can see what's happened after that. So it makes sense that it's gone through that process.
Right.
And it does in some ways, the way he describes it, because it's interesting. But here's I did find
good
from it is from The World Beyond the Hill, last essay, because he's talking about first the discovery of our history and the exploration of the world left no room for the imagination in those vast blank areas of time and space that had previously been its playing fields. The world beyond the hill must have psychological distance in order to exist. Nothing ruins a story of universals more than particular criticism. And then he says here, Shakespeare in a play brought in a number of men saying they had suffered shipwreck in Bohemia, where there is no sea nearby, some 100 miles. It's a bit absurd. But then he says, through the Middle Ages, the chief setting of removed literature was time, the historical past. The geography of the Odyssey and the Oresteia was only a stone's throw from the front doors of their audience. The same is true of the medieval epic and romance. It may well have added to the power of Greek tragedy and Tristan and Parsifal that they were displaced only at sufficient time to allow miracles, but that the giant heroic men they spoke of walked in familiar lands. It raised the slim possibility that what had happened once might happen again.
Hmm.
So it is again beyond the hill, and it's like, because even though it's they're in the same place, but the world beyond the hill there is partially time. It's the
Yeah.
past.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it says the Renaissance, however, in unearthing classical literature, made for itself the beginnings of a new and more particular history that, as it became more detailed during the next 2 centuries, left less and less room for the marvelous. As the history of England was pieced together, it finally became necessary for the poets to admit that that they had told several lies about King Arthur.
Oh man, more than a few, but I love it. There's
Yeah,
still, that's good
but
stuff. Yeah.
then the critics come along and say, "Well, it's all garbage,"
Yeah. Right.
because the
Right.
facts aren't correct. But it's not the facts.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the facts, man. We don't want the facts, man.
It's a deeper fact though, isn't it?
It is.
It's
Yeah,
like
because
it's a
yeah,
poetic fact.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Love it. Yeah, but yeah, it's cool. There we go.
In science, the notion of emergence has become salient. Has SF literature ever explored this topic? I mean, in a depiction of the process to its conclusion and aftermath.
I'm trying to. Can you explain more what you mean by
Yeah,
emergence?
yeah. So I'm not
So
100%
let's
sure.
see. In science, the notion of emergence has become salient. Um, yeah, if you could expound on that just a little bit. Um, is it what Callian?
Yeah,
Callian, and nice to meet you, by the way. Um, Science fiction goes through these periods. I mean, there's little phases. It's like I remember in the '90s, there was a lot of singularity stories.
oh yeah, yeah,
Where every other story in analog would be about something having to do with that. So I have I have no doubt that if emergence is something um, that people are writing stories about it, and there'll be many, because science fiction is definitely, I'm going to do that to try to focus myself here. Um, Science fiction is in conversation with itself. I mean, the best of it. And I mean, throughout the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, you could read stories that were responses to other stories by different authors, and that's one of the joys of it. It's like this big conversation. So often you'll read a story in analog that'll contain a concept like what I'm assuming emergence is, and then someone will write a response, or they'll inspire them to take it further or something like that. But I can't point to anything without knowing more about what
yeah,
emergence
no,
is.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I was just thinking that I'm trying to remember the short history of science fiction that was published in Fantastic, April 1971. Uh, yeah, he's talking about the Gernsback, saying that there's only one with science fiction. Um,
So I think so. Emergence. It says this is
oh,
Britannica. Emergence in evolutionary theory, the rise of a system that cannot be predicted or explained from antecedent conditions. So
yeah, he
oh, we
goes
go.
this way: a process where the change accelerates to a point that what emerges is totally different than what came before, sort of making absolute
Here we go.
what came obsolete. Sorry, obsolete what came before.
Yeah. So that's interesting stuff.
Yeah,
I'm not going to be able to point you to a specific piece of work, but yeah. So that idea that like I don't know. There's an idea out there in science. In fact, I would say that a lot of scientists are um, of the belief that if you know all the conditions, you can predict the future, right? If
yeah.
you know everything, but you can't know everything, right? But you know everything, then the whole thing is really just clockwork when you get down to it. It's clockwork, practically like a software thing. But the idea that there's things that are emerging, that there's emergence that doesn't seem to follow the antecedents is a fascinating thing. Yeah.
Well, I
But
guess
I can't point you to a specific work.
I was just thinking,
Mhm.
like, as an offshoot of that to a certain extent. But yeah, it may not. I was thinking of Childhood End, where humanity is, being. It's like it reaches the pinnacle of evolution, but humanity doesn't go up because they're being plucked by this other, uh, you know, um,
Mhm.
civilization in the universe because it changes completely. Like it's that in a sense is that, I think, isn't it? If you think
Yeah,
of
I think so.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because and there has been things like that where humanity evolves into something completely different. Like
Mhm.
it's no longer human. They're no
Yeah,
longer
for
human,
sure. Yeah.
and other aliens have done that too. So I
Mhm.
think that has happened in science fiction, but maybe not in the strict wording that you've got there. It just, again, they play with the concept a little bit.
Yeah.
Writers will play with the concept.
Yeah. I guess I can name a story that's like the opposite of emergence. A story. It's a famous one called "The Cold Equations" by Tom Godwin. Which is have you read that one? It's a famous story
Sure.
about the the universe just being a cold equation, and there's a spaceship that is headed to deliver some medicine to a planet, and there's a stowaway on board, but they only have enough fuel to get to where they're going and to deliver this medicine, this life-saving medicine, to this planet that needs it. Anyway, it's a good one. Yeah, Asimov's the
Yeah,
last question. Yeah.
yeah. Aya reaches the point of becoming God after the
Mm-hmm.
end. Yeah, yeah. That's good, and yeah, because it's like, oh, what's the answer or something like that, or what's the thing, and it's like, well, still computing, still
Mm-hmm.
computing.
Yeah. So I have no idea why my camera went blurry, but
Yeah.
uh, yeah, this AI reaches a point of becoming God after the end of humanity. That's that's something I would look at Hyperion for some of that.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
Hyperion series, there's four of those,
yeah.
and then see
Well, even
something came to mind there. Go ahead.
I was thinking on a different way of this is the billion names of God,
Yeah.
because that kind of is sort of similar because like you get the answer, and the thing is the answer sort of um
Mm-hmm.
is just the answer stops everything,
Right. Right.
and like they're all searching for the answer,
Mm-hmm.
but you sometimes don't want the answer.
Yeah.
Yes,
I
can we
remember. Yeah.
reverse entropy is the
Interesting.
question asked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know in the Ender's Game series as well, there's an AI or a life form that emerges from the complexity of the networks between the planets, and her name is Jane. He's given a name,
Yeah.
but that's interesting too. Can we reverse entropy? Yeah, I mean
Well,
that's good stuff right there. I mean that's fascinating to think about too.
because well, in the Simac book this month, got to
Yeah.
get that in.
Uh
Cosmic
huh.
Engineers. At
hmm
the end of that, they've got enough energy that you could probably reverse entropy.
Yeah.
They don't
Yeah.
have enough energy to do that.
hmm
But you got to
there's a
deal with
really
that.
good book. At least I liked it. I don't know how many people like it, but it's from the '80s, so I don't know if you read it. But The Practice Effect by David Brin. That is a reverse
I haven't
entropy
read that
book.
one though.
Yeah, it's yeah. The more you use something, the better it gets at doing the thing that you're using it for.
Uh,
So you could take a stick and start using it as an axe, and eventually it'll turn into an axe. So it's the practicing of it is reversing entropy and making it what it
oh,
is.
but that's not science fiction according to
Oh,
Google
of course
Trend.
not. Yeah. Yep.
Oh yeah, that
Oh,
was
thanks, Callie. And those are fascinating questions.
yeah. Well, these
Yeah.
are the kind of things that he does deal with, like, or
Yeah.
those kind of thought patterns.
Mm-hmm.
He deals with it.
Oh, here we go. Hot
Robert
Sky Midnight.
Silverberg's Hot Sky at Midnight has the theme of climate change forcing humans to either change its biology or go to the stars.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
Yeah, and
kind of thing.
if you think about it, eventually that's going to have to happen. I'm
Yeah.
not talking whatever the short range climate stuff is, but eventually our star is going to be a red giant, is what I understand. Their prediction of which stars go nova and all that stuff. But I know it's millions of years down the road, but there is, that's the prediction. So eventually, if humanity lasts that long, they're going to have to figure out how to get off the
Well,
planet and move on.
that's the one thing of science fiction. It's used, like a lot of writers have used this fact that it's either you've got this, they'll use technology, if they use technology at all.
Mm-hmm.
Technology, something happens, and how does that affect society and people?
Yep.
Or how do people affect the technology, like
Yes.
their
Right.
reaction against it?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a subtle difference, but that's the thing. Like Heinlein basically, his, like in writing in a symposium, which they do mention, um, from, yeah, science fiction novel. There was a symposium that was done, and Heinlein basically says that his. Oh, wait a minute! I'm getting mixed up because he wrote. There's two essays that are kind of similar, but anyway, in one of these essays, he talks about that it's there's something that happens, technology or an event that happens, and then it's he writes about the change within the person,
Hmm.
and once that change has happened, that's the end of the story.
Hmm.
It does it like everything else can continue on. That's not the purpose of the story. It's the change. How
Yeah.
did that change come about in that person? And that's sort of his view of science fiction. You see, and then that's where it's his the reaction people have against technology, where John W. Campbell's was more, and I'm really paraphrasing here, so
Mm-hmm.
nobody say that that's not exactly what it was, but that's part of it. And John W. Campbell was how the technology changes society. So there's subtle differences. It's technology, but or events that change society, but rather than how does the person change within, as a reaction against it. It's a
Yeah.
subtle difference, I think, but there is a difference there.
That is interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that he looks at it that way because Orson Scott Card has this thing. I have no idea if it originated with him, but it's called the Mice Quotient, MICE. So when
Oh
you're
yeah,
writing
yeah,
science fiction stories, you've got, I've called it up because I didn't remember what they all were, but you have a milieu story, which concerns the world that the characters are in, and the stories about the world, right? And then you have an idea story, which concerns information you intend the reader to uncover or learn as they read. And then there's a character story, which concerns the nature of at least one of the characters in your story, what this character does and why they do it. And then you have an event story, which is, it says it concerns what happens and why it happens. But so a milieu story, it begins when the main character enters a new world and ends when the main character comes back from the new world. So it's the there and back again, like The
yeah.
Hobbit, right? And then the idea story, it begins when your character meets an obstacle. They have a problem that needs to be solved, and then it ends when they've answered the question and removed the obstacle.
That's Heinlein's
Right, that's
basic
a Heinlein
story.
space,
Yeah,
right? And then the character one is your character is unbearably dissatisfied with their role in society and sets about changing it, and it ends when your character either finds a new role or is content to return to the old one.
yeah. That's where Heinlein started, I think, according
Uh,
to Alexei Panshin. But then he changed because he was dissatisfied with it.
right. And then the event story is your character tries to restore order to the world as the beginning, and then it ends when your character succeeds or fails.
Where would you put Simak into all that?
Well, geez, it depends on the book. It
Exactly.
depends on the book. And the thing is, you've got an overarching arch, but you can also have arches inside, right?
Yeah.
So you can have character stories inside an event story. When you're talking about novel length, when you're talking about short stories, you're really dealing with
Yeah.
one of these at a time.
Oh, that's the one thing he does mention. He thinks, well, it was very in passing, so I'm not sure exactly what he meant. At one point, he said somewhere that almost that short stories should be thrown out and it should
Yeah,
be novels.
I think he
Yeah,
actually said short stories were dead. It was
yeah,
back in the 70s, which was disappointing because I still like short. In fact,
yeah.
my favorite author right now is Ted Chiang, and he's a modern author, right? Writes only short fiction. So like I'm rowing against the stream in every way on that one,
Yeah.
right? But but it's interesting. I think that what he's saying is the short story as the main driver of the ideas,
Yeah,
which is what it used to be, is not so anymore, right? I think, especially in today's publishing world, um, it's almost impossible to make a living writing short stories.
yeah,
You'd have to write so many of them, and I think it was even that way for Harlan Ellison and Robert Silverberg and that little group. They used to write. They wrote so many. They had pseudonyms. They wrote in different
yeah,
genres. They put them in detective magazines and science fiction magazines and all that stuff. But you still have people that are known for their short fiction. I would say Ray Bradbury.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean Martian Chronicles is short fiction really. It's a collection of short fiction, and
Simak as
Fahrenheit
well.
451 is
Yeah,
small, and I mean we have so much of Simak's short fiction to read.
yeah,
But there are people like Ted Chiang who writes only short fiction, um, but it's rare. It's just really rare, really rare.
yeah. Before I get to Callian's point, this reminded me of something else that he was talking about. That science fiction has basically supported itself all the way through because the fans have supported it for the
Mm-hmm.
conventions, the magazines, and
Yeah.
he doesn't talk about. I think partially he's talking about where there's sometimes grants and stuff like that for literature that like other types of literature cannot support itself
Mm-hmm.
generally on its own, or at least I think that's the idea he was saying. But science fiction has always supported itself on its own, he
Yeah.
says,
Yeah.
which is an interesting way to look at it as well.
For sure. Hey, I'm going to stop my camera for a second to see if it clears
Okay.
up.
Callian says evolutionary change is a slow process. Technological change is a fast process. Is genetic modification the path to a really fast process that cannot be reversed and
There we go.
inevitably leads to whatever?
Yeah. Read some Simak on that stuff, right?
Yeah,
This genetic modification, City by Clifford Simak, is a really fascinating thing. So genetic on that they wanted to go live on Jupiter, so genetic modification was the way to go. But there's tons of science fiction about genetic modification, where I mean everything from transferring your consciousness into a robot to changing your body so that it can survive different planets, and how that could be done or how that would be done, or just I say how it would be done. Some of the stories are interested in the technology of how it would be done. Some stories are okay. This can happen, so now we're telling a story where that kind of thing can happen. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah. Or what's the effect of this happening? Because there was
Right.
something I just saw something where did I read a synopsis of a new science fiction novel, or somebody was saying it on BookTube, and I can't remember now. But anyway, it was in a future where like there's certain people that had enough money to genetically modify their children who they were smarter, and then they turned out to be living forever. And then there's the conflict. The people that didn't have it are
Mm-hmm.
fighting against them,
Yeah.
and stuff
Yeah.
like this. There's a pushback. So there's that. However, I kind of wonder if it's a genetic modification, if they can modify it, like he says, the path is really fast but cannot be reversed. If you can put it one way, you should be able to put it the other way, couldn't you?
Yeah. You think
Theoretically,
so?
it makes sense. You could do whatever you want if you could do
Right.
genetic modification.
Yeah. Exactly. Mark is here. Hello,
Yeah.
Mark. I got my Cubs hat on, Mark, because we've started spring training. Oh,
Octavia,
nice. Octavia Butler. Oh, that's great.
uh,
I
Xena
think that
and
first book in there is called Dawn, Dawn.
Genetic Mother. Yeah,
Yeah,
I do. That made a short list for our. That was a short list,
yeah.
but it
I
got
love.
bumped.
She's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
she's great. If a book to read right now, and again, is yeah, Hope Springs Eternal, um, is Parable of the Sower. Um, is a good book for our time.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's by Octavia Butler.
Oh, that's why. Yeah, okay,
Yep,
yeah,
yep. But it's prescient.
yeah. Because in our thing that's starting, newer science fiction or more contemporary science fiction to read,
Mm,
I had Octavia Butler's uh, Xenogenesis in there, or at least the first book, but then
mm.
wanted to do two standalones, so it got bumped.
Yeah, yeah. She's great. Yeah, she's super good. But so I mean, if you look at that Parable of the Sower, it's dystopian, and so it's interesting, on Panshin, the subject of what we're talking about. So what Octavia Butler has done is a kind of, if this goes on, then this is what's going to happen, right?
Yeah,
And Panshin is a champion of the idea that let's show the way through and present alternatives. Things don't have to be the way that they are. How could they be different, and what does it look like to be different? And then write fiction that shows you what that world is like, something to strive for, right?
yeah, and like this is the thing that like the introduction was written in 1980. I'm pretty sure it says 80 or was it 79? 1980, February 1980.
Mm.
Um, and like I said to you, I wonder what because they had sort of a I think because after the dust had settled with New Wave, they had optimism of where science fiction is going to go. And I haven't really read any more because I know their website. Uh, it's still up there, but it's not updated. And they did have newer essays on it, and they'd still always write essays, but I haven't read anything
Hmm.
new like in the 2000s. I'm curious to see what they think about that, and that could be in his new memoir, or that's coming
Yeah,
out in a
yeah.
couple
You
of
had
weeks.
me. I looked that up. Let's see if I have that. But
If there's
that's
a
a book that's
synopsis,
coming out by Panshin very soon. So you say they've got the Panshins have a website and it's
yeah,
got essays on it.
yeah, yeah, it's got essays. I don't know how much. I forget what it's called. Is it Gateway? What's it called? I can't remember what it's called now. Um, I pulled it up just to look to see something, and that's where I found that
Mm-hmm.
new
There we go.
book. Um,
There it is. The new book is called "Following My Nose," and Panshin discusses his own journey as well as works that influence his own writing and on science fiction in general. Authors like A. E. Van Vogt, Charles Dodgson, and others have shaped both the genre as well as Panshin's own art. So I recently got Rites of Passage by him, and have not read that yet, but I'm gonna definitely read it.
yeah, I've got to get a copy. I'd like to reread it. It's called The Abyss of Wonder, is the
Hmm.
name of the website, but it's sort
Okay,
of
The Abyss of
it's
Wonder.
yeah. I I don't
That's
think
like
any
it's like a contradictory title. It's like an abyss sounds like a dark, demonic hole, and then it says of wonder. That's pretty
but
good.
yeah, it's like I haven't really looked at it that much. I know there because he wrote that Heinlein and Dimension. That was one of his first sort of full
Mm-hmm.
critical thing of Heinlein, and it didn't go over well with Heinlein. It was
Mm-hmm.
published by Advent Publishers. Heinlein was a friend with the publisher, and he tried to get the publisher to squash it, and he wouldn't.
Oh
So
man,
that ended their friendship.
not a fan, huh?
Yeah, and he because he didn't want anybody discussing his work until after he had died, and even then, if he could stop it, he would.
He would.
Uh,
Wow. Wow.
And then there's a whole section about Heinlein, but I read the first one, and he's complimentary of him, but he's just saying you can't read Heinlein in an objective way like Heinlein wanted you to read. You have to read it subjectively. Like, Heinlein is not telling you exactly what's happening in the world without any kind of emotion or anything like that. It's not cold. He's contradictory in everything, even his politics. He's absolutely contradictory, which is perfectly fine for him. And he says if you read it this way, then you can enjoy Heinlein. But if you read it objectively, that's where the decisiveness comes in, with people either hate him or love him.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, yeah, and then where was I going with this? Oh, yes, there is. He wrote an essay on there about writing the book that's on The Abyss of Wonder, and I think the publisher as well wrote something, because there's a lot of myth that came up around this as well. So
Gotcha.
apparently
Yeah.
these two essays, even though they contradict each other, I think a little bit, if I remember right, they sort of clear up some stuff.
Yeah. Cool. So I imagine we're getting close to a close here, but I wanted to bring up a couple of things that are sort of personal science fiction history stuff that I thought was pretty cool. So here this was in the fourth essay. It says a year ago, and this was written in 1972, I think. It says a year ago, Harry Harrison, a former vice president of the Science Fiction Writers of America, declared that he was withdrawing all his books and stories from contention for the Nebula Awards as a protest against all the good stories that had lost and all the bad stories that had won.
And then that goes back to the Frederick Pohl.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. That's a fun detail. And then this one about Algis Budrys. In last November's issue of Galaxy, Algis Budrys publicly resigned as House book reviewer. There were, he said, admirable stories and popular stories. He knew an admirable story when he saw one, though he didn't always enjoy it very much. As for what was enjoyable and popular, well, Budrys had lost his innocent eye and couldn't entirely tell anymore what was likable. And when he could identify something that was enjoyable, the remnants of his innocence tripped his tongue and prevented him from being able to say what it was. So he was quitting.
Well, at least he knew.
Yeah,
At least he knew.
I think it's great. I love those details. That's fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there are a couple things. The one I forgot, but it was interesting reading through the introduction, because I'd not read that introduction before. I've had the first edition, and I've read some of the essays. Mostly, I just looked up in the index and read what they had to say about a specific point. Now, and I have over the years sort of built up a collection of science fiction reference books, and it's kind of weird. Almost everything they reference, I have.
That is awesome. Yeah.
Very
cool.
Except in the back, like they do have a bibliography that's really sort of highbrow stuff. That I don't have all that, but the science fiction criticism and other people that they talk about,
great.
I have it, and it's like, how did that happen? And the only thing I can think of is it's somehow this sort of permeated into my subconscious, something in here when I read this, but I haven't read it in so long that I can't remember.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, that's great. Yeah, I sure did enjoy this. So hopefully we'll talk about some. What's section 2? Let's see. Section 2 is called SF in the 70s. That's going to be fun.
Yeah.
And then section 3 is Heinlein Reread, which will feed right into our Heinlein stuff.
Yeah, because I read the first one and talked about it a bit the last video we did.
Yeah. And then I have part 4 is the renewal of SF. And then part 5 is a season of change.
That's not in. Those essays are not in.
Wasn't there something in there? I thought, the death of science fiction is actually the last essay.
Yeah.
The death of science fiction, a dream.
A dream. And then when I read that, I go, well, that was after reading Hyperion for me. that science
Oh,
fiction had died.
science fiction
Oh,
died after Hyperion.
yeah.
Yep.
This is the interesting thing. Oh, that's the other thing that I was going to say. He talks about writers because of the new wave aspect. Some, some decided to stop writing, and then others decided, like him and Cory Panshin, almost to go into sort of the research about the history of
Yeah.
science fiction.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I did, because after I tried other bits of science fiction, I definitely stopped reading science fiction for a long
Mm-hmm.
time. But I started reading stuff like this, like
Oh,
the
interesting. Yeah.
history of science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
started looking into that, history of magazines. That's what I did, and that's where I started collecting stuff
Yeah. Yeah.
that I then wanted to read in the future. And it was like, whoa, that sounds familiar.
Mm-hmm. That's
Like
cool.
what, 20, 30 years, 20 some years, or maybe 30 years distant.
Yeah. Right. I hear that. Well, that's fun.
Well, thanks for
Very
stopping
cool.
by, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. This is always fun, Sean. Thanks for letting me come on.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this, because it gives me a kick up the butt to read some other, these things from cover to cover, because I haven't read them from cover to, or a lot of them from cover to cover.
Right,
I just
right.
used it to dip into.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, Gavin's here, because I'll
Cheers,
show
Gavin.
you. Yeah,
Yeah.
I showed you 2 books that I showed Gavin 2 books I want to read, and I'll show you them later after we're
Mhm.
finished here, because I want to get those. They've been sitting on my shelf for several years, and I need to read these.
Oh, that's great. Good.
And Gavin's guy, hopefully, he's got one of them, so we'll definitely start with that one. But that'll be future, and I'd love it if
Fantastic.
you join in too.
Oh, cool. Yeah, let's see what they are. But yeah,
Yeah.
good to see you, Gavin,
Thanks, Alex.
and Alex, and everybody. Thanks, all.
Bye, everybody.